I've worked in entire production code bases that have fewer custom errors than this. So let's say that we throw this invalid placement exception. And I want to know where we handle this / what we do. Function A might call function B, might call validate move. And you might leapfrog entirely over B to handle your exception. This validate move, instead of returning none, let's say that, which by the way is already a red flag, let's say that it returns a bool instead. We're returning F. Press F to pay respects, okay? Now all I have to do is I have to look at what called this method. That's it. So what we're reviewing today is a Python-based implementation of Scrabble. The ones that I found online had bugs or were limited in their malleability. So I tried to decide one for myself for my first big project. Some parts of it, namely the settings manager, are kind of disgusting, but they work well and I'm too scared to mess with them right now. I feel like this is on its own sort of a red flag. This is something that I feel like really screams to me that you didn't test. You didn't write tests. That's fine. It's a personal project. I don't write tests for all of my personal projects. Totally agreed. But I think this means that you're not super comfortable with refactoring, which means that the tests would really help you. You can take small chunks, the most complicated bits that you're most worried about breaking. Picture all of the things that you, the first time around, had a hard time implementing. Those are the things that if I were you, I would test first. You don't need to go from 0% code coverage to 100% code coverage in one day. Let's get to the actual repo, shall we? One, your directory structure here is perfectly flat, which I think I would generally recommend not doing that. So if this was like your main, and then you had like a subdirectory for like your models, which I'm sure you have some, maybe another subdirectory for like errors. And this is the first thing we're going to talk about today is your errors. And maybe like another subdirectory for like controllers or things that make things actually happen as opposed to just things that hold data. Then just from like a general understanding perspective of like where to go look for the parts that I care about, it would have been a little bit easier. So just from like and that means it's easier for you and it's easier for anyone picking up your project. So that's not like a nit of like, look at all this work you're making me do to do your code review. That's a nit of like, this is like a readability thing. Like just based off names, I have these random associations, right? Player, I'm thinking is probably going to mostly be handling data, which it seems like it is, right? So this would be like a model. Compare that to something like move, validate move. See, this is what I'm talking about. Validate move. This is absolutely behavior, right? This is behavior. This is like game logic. This would be nice to have in a controller. In general, I'm going to say that errors, enums, slightly a red flag that you're grouping a bunch of classes into one spot. But it's understandable if they're all really small. So I'm like, okay, what's going on in errors.py? I see that you've got your base exception, which is nice, good, great. But now I see a ton of exceptions. Okay? And so immediately I have slight alarm bells going off. And I want to describe to you how I view exceptions and how I think exceptions generally tend to get used. The main reason I say this is I've worked in entire production code bases that have fewer custom errors than this. I think there's two types of errors. Let's say you have a chess game, okay? I'm not going to draw out a correct chessboard, but you can make a mental leap that this is a chessboard. And let's say on move 1, I try to push my pawn 3 places, okay? This is incorrect. It's a validation error, right? This is an error. This is something that when you think about it from a human perspective. You're like, this player made an error. So I think it's very enticing to make an error for it. Let's pretend you have like an online chess game. A player might just misclick. And so that type of thing happens a lot. It's very foreseeable. This is the type of thing that you generally would tend to handle without an exception. An exception is more like it's player one's turn and all of a sudden some of the squares are gone. Like this, you could physically foresee happening, but should never happen at all. This is a big difference. You end up with very confusing control flow, or potentially very confusing control flow, by using your exceptions as like frivolously or like freely is this. Not to be like, you were throwing them around willy-nilly. So you said the settings manager is one of the things that you think is particularly gross. Red flag number 2 that I am confused about. Let me make sure I'm not insane. Yeah, red flag number 2 is that you have a nested class. I don't really see this that often. I'm not sure why this would be nested specifically. There are multiple Scrabble systems. Okay. Is the problem here that, let's say you want this to be settings manager for game type 1? I feel like in my head, the reason you're doing this is basically you don't want anyone else to have to worry about this version of game mechanics, this version of board settings, this version of tile scoring. I think really what I want to get to here, or what you need here, is like a factory design pattern. You have game mode 1, you have game mode 2. Game mode 1 and game mode 2 have different settings, different things they maybe have to load, different concerns, right? I see in here, you've got game mechanics and you've got this maximum rack size, but maybe a different game mode doesn't even have that. Pass in a game mode, all of the logic of creating a valid game class is going to happen in the game factory, and then you are going to spit out a valid game. Right now, it feels like there is game that handles some stuff, and then there is settings manager that's handling way more stuff. And the idea is basically that the settings manager then pumps stuff uniformly into game, as opposed to it being game that handles most things, and game has a very tiny settings manager inside of it that handles very few things. Does this sort of feel better to you? Like this idea that you would put most of the complexity into the game. General feedback. A cleaner separation, even just in directory structure, between models and controllers might be helpful for readability. Control flow. You're currently leaning pretty heavily on exceptions for controlling your control flow. Try to avoid using exceptions to control things that you could see happening in the average game. Handling different game modes. You treated the settings manager as the main point of variability between this game mode and future potential game mode implementations. The game that's instantiated should be the thing handling most of this variability. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing that by. This was a really cool project to look at. Glad to hopefully be able to help. Obviously, if you still want code review on the project, you can always resubmit later after you make these changes, maybe after you add a different game mode. I'd super appreciate it.